In this video, I'll be talking in depth about how to use the different channel types that you can set up using this drop-down menu here. So if you've watched the previous videos, you will have seen that I've been sometimes changing this drop-down here to different things to achieve different effects. But now I'm going to actually go through and explain that in detail. So the first type that is the default type for all the channels is simply a constant value. So when you have that, as the name suggests, it's just applying a constant color or a constant metallic across your whole layer. As I've shown, you can use masks to actually make sure that that isn't applied across the whole material, but the color itself or the metallic itself is just going to be constant. The other type I've used in a previous video is texture. And this is basically to let you add an image texture node, and that's going to show that image for that particular channel. So, for example, I'm going to import an image. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the base color image of this rock PBR material that I have. So this PBR material has a color and ambient occlusion and various other channels. But for now, I'm just going to select the color. And I'm just going to use that as my base color. So what you can see now is that I have just the color turned on and I'm just using this individual image, which is basically being, by default, UV mapped across that model. Now, whenever you have an image like this, to the right of that image, you can choose whether or not you use the color output, or you can just focus on, say, the red output. So that's converting the red color to a grayscale, the green, blue, or alpha. So you're going to be able to do this whenever you're kind of dealing with these images like this. And as I showed in the previous video, you can paint over an image like this. Now in this case, because this is something I've imported from a file, if I try to paint that, it's going to give me a paint warning. And this is basically saying you're about to save over the image. So in other words, if I was just to paint over this and then save it, it would actually corrupt the original file. So because of that, you have an option to either make a copy of that image, pack the image. So packing basically means that it's going to save it internally within the blend file. Or you can do nothing, in which case you will get a separate warning saying you're risking corrupting the original file. So that's just there as a check to make sure that you don't accidentally paint over your images. So I can click pack image, and now it's packed it safely as a separate image independent of the original file, so that if I want to paint over it, I'm not risking saving that over the original image. So when you're using an image like this, you can change things like the interpolation of that image. You can also change the color or correct the color. And there's various things you can do when you've got an image in here to actually adjust that. So for example, when I'm using the base color channel, I can add an ambient occlusion image. And if we go import, I can select that ambient occlusion. And now what that's doing is it's basically applying that ambient occlusion as a multiplier to add that effect to the base color. So if we bring that down, you can see the difference. It adds the subtle ambient occlusion onto that image. And you can change how you blend that. By default, it's set to multiply, but you can change it. You can also adjust the hue, saturation, and value. So that adds a separate node that then you can change the hue of that and all of these other settings. You can also adjust the RGB curve. So for example, we can do this, add a point in here. You can change specific ones like the red. We can make it more red if we want. And this is going to be the case for any time you're using an image as an image texture like this. And then the final thing you can do is you can use a color ramp. And so that's going to take the grayscale value of that image and then apply a color ramp to give you your final output. So you can change this to different colors if you want. And this is going to give you control over how you're kind of mapping that image to a final result. So lots of different options here. You can use all of these together, any combination of them, to take your original image and output your final values for that channel, for that layer. Final thing you can do is you can change the mapping. So by default, I mentioned that this is a UV mapping, so it's using my UVs to map the image onto the mesh, but you can change this to box if you want. Now it looks kind of weird because I've got this painted part in here, And what it's basically doing when you do this box mapping is it's projecting it from the different directions onto the mesh. That process allows you to basically blend those different projections together, which is using this seam blend. Now, I might actually reload that original image so that it doesn't look silly. So I've now re-imported that original image without the painting on it. And you can see now what the blending is doing is just blending those projections together. Okay, so before I move on to the other types that you can use for the channel, I want to show you how you can add these PBR image textures to various different channels to build up your overall PBR material. In this case, we can add a roughness and we can change that to texture, and we can do the same thing. And in this case, we want the roughness. And now we can see we have the roughness based on this image as well. The mapping under here is actually the same mapping for all channels, so you don't have to change that independently. So that will keep all the textures in the same mapping. Now we could go through each individual channel and import those images separately and set them up separately. But at this point, I want to introduce this button, and this is a multi-import button, which is basically designed to let you select all of your different channel images that you want, and you can import them all simultaneously, and they will automatically be assigned to each of these channels based on their names. So in this case, if I click this, instead of now selecting just one image for one channel, I'm going to select all of the ones that I want. So I've got 5 in total. If I click import, what that's now done is it's now imported an image into every channel. So we have the color image has been added to here. The roughness image has been added. It has now found the normals. It also adds the AO. So this was already in here from previously, but it will add this as well. And it's also added the height. Now at the moment the height looks a bit ridiculous, so I can drop the scale, or you may not want to use the height texture depending on what it is that you're looking at. It may be enough to use just the normals. But as you can see, by using this multi-import, we can do this instantly and grab all of those images without having to set up each channel independently. So this is really useful if you have large libraries of these PBR textures and you want to import all of them quickly and make many, many different layers very quickly using these different libraries. And the final thing I'll talk about relating to using image textures like this is that if you have a mask that also corresponds to this PBR material, so sometimes you may have an opacity mask where you basically only want to apply that to specific regions, you can add that as an image texture as well. So in this case, I don't have a mask for this one, but I'm going to pretend that this ambient occlusion is my mask. And what this is going to do is it's going to basically have a mask that lines up with these different images that you've added in here. To make sure that it does line up, underneath the mask mapping, you can actually link it to the PBR texture mapping. So what that does is it makes sure that this mask is the same mapping as everything you've got in here. So that if I adjust, say for example, the color ramps, what you'll see is that that's actually masking it consistently based on that image. So in this case, it's masking based on the ambient occlusion, but if you had an opacity image, for example, you can actually make sure that that mapping is consistent between these images and the mask image. All right, I'm going to remove that for now. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about the other options that you have in here, now that I've covered everything to do with the image textures. So you can add a procedural texture as well. So when you do this, you have procedural settings in here, and you can choose various different types of procedural textures. And they basically just give you different procedural options for generating these textures. And then you can change all of the settings in here. You can opt to use a color ramp as well. And you can also change the mapping for those procedural textures as well. The other thing you can do is you can actually link a channel to your masks. Now at the moment, I'm not using any masks, but what this is going to do is it's going to link the output of whatever's in your mask stack to that channel. So for example, if I add a procedural mask like this, now my color is actually linked to the mask itself. And you can add a color ramp to actually change how the mask links to that base color. So for example, if I do this, now what it's doing is it's taking the white regions of the mask and it's mapping it to this blue color. And if you do things like this, you can actually create different effects where you're actually linking that mask to a specific color. And of course, you can do this with the different channels as well. So this is really cool if you want to mask out your layer, but actually have your channels be linked to that masking. And to kind of demonstrate this a bit more clearly, if we add another element into our color ramp up here, and maybe make this a different color, you can see that we now have this more complex pattern where basically the outside of the mask is black. It's then going into this blue color here, and then it's got this green color in the middle. Now I'll use this to actually point out how you can adjust the multiplier. So this is a multiplier for the mask, and it basically lets you, for this specific channel, increase the strength of that mask for that channel. So when you increase the multiplier, it's basically making it a stronger color in this case. So we can see that the base color is being applied more heavily within these regions of the mask. So that's the white region of the mask, and it's applying the base color in those regions. The other thing you can do is you can actually ignore the mask. And what it's going to do in this case, it's going to link this to the mask, but it's actually not going to use the mask itself. So now we have black all over here, and that is no longer getting masked. It is just applying a color. So again, you can create cool effects by linking it up like that. All right, so the next type you can do is you can basically make it random. Essentially what random does is it creates a random grayscale value for every object that has this same material. So let's just delete the mask for now because we don't need it anymore. So what it's doing is it's creating this random grayscale value. And if I make a duplicate of this, you can see that it's a different grayscale. And every time you create a new version of that object, you get a different color. You can also use a color ramp with this random, and then you can actually create kind of a gradient of different colors. So now it's creating a random color for each of your objects. So you can do this again with any channel, and it's a really useful way of creating some random deviation between your different objects. If you have more than one of the same thing, you can add a randomness to all of your channels and create some variability between your objects. Okay, and the final thing you can do as a type for the channel is you can actually add a node group. This isn't going to update until I actually click load node group. And at the moment, there's no node groups because I haven't actually created any in this blend file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go across to the shader editor. I'm just going to add some nodes like this, just randomly over here. And I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to add some random stuff. I'm going to select these and go Control G, and that's going to make a node group. And I'm going to connect up the output. So obviously this is going to be a more meaningful node group that you have. So this could be a very specific node setup that you use frequently and that you like to use and is not available in PBR Painter. So if you have something like that, and we can call it example. Now I'm going to delete that from the shader editor in here. It is still available as an actual group, which we can see in here. Now that that's there, I can click load node group. I can find that in here, click OK. And what I can do is I can select from that node group, which output socket do I want to use. So in this case, there was only one, and it's the value one. But if you had multiple, you can select an output socket. And then these values here are basically populated by whatever the inputs were for that node group. So in here we had scale and detail. So in my UI here, I get to change the scale and detail. And as you can see, it's just changing that noise scale and detail. So this is another way, in addition to the custom nodes layer that I showed in a previous video, to add your own custom node groups within your layers. So you're integrating it into a single channel, and then you can still use all the other channels and all of the other masking in exactly the same way that you normally would. All right, so that covers everything I wanted to cover in this video. So just to recap, we have these various different types you can use in here for every single channel, and you can get all sorts of different effects by changing this type. Anyway, that's it for this video, so thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Cheers.